I'd like to use this opportunity to make my statement in relation to the present situation that we face now, the pandemic of COVID-19, and to stress that the key points that states and the dominant society and all of us should bear in mind as we respond to this crisis. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on indigenous peoples based on the reports that I receive, as well as the news that have been coming out. Then I would end my statement with some of the key points that I would like to reiterate insofar as responding to the COVID crisis is concerned. As this crisis has struck all of us in most countries of the world, indigenous peoples are one of the groups that are highly vulnerable to this situation, but they also are the ones who are finding solutions to lessening the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. In terms of impacts, I have been receiving reports about indigenous peoples, especially those who are living in urban areas, of which majority indigenous peoples find themselves in. They are subjected to inequality and discrimination insofar as the response measures are being made. I have received reports in which they are discriminated against, the relief packages that the other groups are receiving. Sometimes in cases in indigenous peoples, the packages are much less than what the others have received. This has been reported to me from indigenous peoples in Asia, as well as in Africa, and even in North America. The other vulnerability is the fact that many indigenous peoples don't have access to public health services, and because of the fact that they are in remote areas, but also because of discrimination again. In many communities, the access to doctors or nurses and even clinics are very limited. This is because many of these communities they have small populations, and many states don't see the importance of setting up adequate public services for them. And in such cases, whenever there is a public crisis, health crisis like an epidemic or a pandemic like COVID-19, they don't receive the necessary tests that they have to go through to determine whether they are positive or not, as well as the services that are needed, like ventilators, or even being admitted to such kinds of hospitals or clinics. The other vulnerability are indigenous peoples who are in voluntary isolation. The moment that this virus enters a community in voluntary isolation, the threat of genocide is very high, because these people in voluntary isolation, they haven't developed any immunity to most of the diseases that are coming from the dominant society. And the fact that COVID-19, there's no immunity yet, will further exacerbate the situation that they are facing. I have received reports about indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation in the Amazon, where a few people have already been infected, and I have yet to receive much more adequate reports on how this is affecting the whole community. But that is a population of indigenous peoples that is really in a very highly vulnerable situation. The other issue is in relation to the responses that the states have developed. In cases where emergency rule has been imposed, in some countries, the indigenous peoples, and the other people in general are subjected to very authoritarian measures undertaken by the police or the military. In some cases, the people are harassed for just for on the guise that they are violating the measures that have been put in place. And in a way, this also has led to some indigenous peoples being arrested and put in jail on the pretext that they have violated some of these COVID emergency measures. Uh, the issue of food security is a very serious issue as well. There are indigenous peoples who are very much relying on the production of their own food, and for instance, the Maasais, whose main livelihood is cattle ranching and cattle raising, uh, and they are very much mobile people. So the nomadic nature of their livelihood is now very much curtailed because of the lockdowns that have been put in place. So they cannot herd their cattle, and this has serious implications for the survival of their cattle, as well as the food security for the Maasais and the other pastoralist people. They cannot go to the markets to sell their cattle, and this also is the case with indigenous peoples who have shifted to cash crop production, like in the Philippines, for instance. Many of the indigenous peoples who are raising temperate vegetables, they cannot sell their products anymore because of the lockdowns. They cannot travel to bring the food that they have, the crops that they have produced, to the markets. So and in most cases, many of these indigenous farmers are dependent on the debt that they have that they need to take so that they will be able to buy the inputs that are needed for the farms. And now there is no possibility for them to pay these debts because of the inability to sell their crops in the market. The other cases that I have received reports on is in relation to, again, the provision of basic necessities like water, for instance, which is very much needed to ensure better sanitation, to protect the people against COVID crisis. There have been reports about the Navajo people in Arizona and in New Mexico, whose communities don't have public potable water coming to their communities. So the advice that people need to wash their hands very often is not being followed, simply because there's no water that is available in their communities. They have to travel outside of their communities to get water and to use this for sanitation purposes and to protect themselves from being infected with the virus. So these are just some of the reports that I have received, and it's since many indigenous peoples are appealing that the states should not discriminate against them when they are developing such responses, and they should not also be using the emergency response to continually harass them and persecute them, and also to violate their basic human right to life, to mobility, and of course to their livelihoods as well. The appeal that has come from many indigenous peoples is, and this has been echoed by the United Nations Secretary General, as well as the other colleagues in who are mandate holders in the UN. The appeal is that human rights should be at the center of the measures in the measures to address the crisis. In no way should the right to life be curtailed on the grounds that these are on the justification that COVID has to be addressed. The cases of indigenous peoples who have either died because of lack of services, as well as those who have been arrested on the pretext that they are not adhering to some of the emergency measures, should not be continued. There should be a monitoring on how indigenous peoples are being given the adequate relief measures, as well as other measures, public health measures, that they need to have for them to be able to survive. It has also been stressed that they should not be subjected to discrimination when receiving responses, when receiving support from the states and other actors, for them to be able to address the problem of this pandemic. The importance of stressing human rights cannot be overestimated, because it's really the protection that indigenous peoples need for them to be able to go through this pandemic. The other development that I have seen is that while many indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected by COVID, like there was a report by the Guardian newspaper yesterday saying that in New Mexico, while indigenous peoples are 6% of the population, 16% of them are affected by the COVID crisis, and this is very disproportionate in relation to the small number of indigenous peoples in those states. And so the other issue that came out is that when they are collecting data in relation to those infected by the virus, they don't have disaggregated data on indigenous peoples. In fact, in the cases of in the US, for instance, they are categorized as others. So there's no concrete data on how many indigenous peoples have been affected, and how many have died, and how many have received the relief packages that are being provided by the government. I think this is something that indigenous peoples have been requesting since time immemorial, that there should be disaggregated data which would make them more visible insofar as they are affected by the public health issues that they are facing. As far as the response from the indigenous peoples is concerned, I have received reports, and I have seen even in my own community how the traditional responses when epidemics occur are really being put into full play. Isolation, or what is now known as lockdown, is a practice that indigenous peoples have traditionally done for a long time. Even as a child, I know in my own community, whenever there is an epidemic, they will isolate the community. They will not allow people to come out of their own communities, as well as people outside to come in. And they will maintain that for as long as the situation of epidemics are, whether this is an epidemic for people or even for animals. No? So I think that there are many indigenous peoples who have been doing this practice, and in some places where they continue to practice this even without the government instruction that they do this, they already have been doing it. And I can cite my province as a case. This is Mountain Province in the Philippines, in the Cordillera region. Up to now, there is no one affected by the virus. No, the reports say that there is 0 cases of persons affected by the virus, and indigenous peoples, our people, the Kankanay Igorots, we continue to practice the ubaya, the tilngaw, the ubaya, where we are not allowed to go in, or people are not allowed to, people outside are not allowed to go in, or people inside the communities are not allowed to go out. So maybe this is one factor which has led to such a situation where up to now there is no report of COVID infection. I know there are other people in other parts of the world, like in Latin America, even in Australia, I think, where they also practice this traditional practice of isolating themselves whenever such kinds of public health issues come up. Of course, this can only be done when indigenous peoples are still in their territories, and they are the ones basically governing themselves, so they can impose this on themselves but also on others. In situations where indigenous peoples are in urban centers and they are mixed with other populations, this is not the case. The other situation that I've seen is indigenous peoples who continue to practice their livelihoods, like subsistence agriculture. They still have food that can sustain them even when they are isolating themselves from the rest of society. As long as they are producing their own food, they can continue to survive. However, as I mentioned earlier, in cases where they have shifted towards cash crop production for the market, the situation is different, because their cash crops now on which they are dependent on are not being bought, and therefore they find themselves more in debt, and also the food that they can consume are also limited in terms of diversity. So I think that the call for indigenous people, from indigenous peoples, which I fully support, is first to ensure that their human rights to life, to their livelihoods, to protect their territories, and to continue some of their traditional practices to address such situations should be respected and protected. Secondly, that they should not be discriminated against and suffer from inequality in terms of responses to the COVID crisis. They should receive relief packages. Public health services should be made available for them, and basic necessities such as water should also be provided for them, so as not for them, so it will prevent them from having to go out of their communities to fetch water, which will increase the cases of infection. Indigenous peoples are also very much stressing that the emergency responses should not be used to justify the continuing persecution as well as criminalization against them. We have these situations in which they are either arrested, they are being stigmatized, and they are being charged of they are charged by the government of a case of criminal acts which justify their being put into jail. So the call to stop criminalization, stigmatization, and the labeling of indigenous peoples as terrorists or as communists should stop, and this should not be further exacerbated by the COVID response. Finally, I think that the request for them to be able to strengthen their own traditional livelihood systems, as well as their own governance systems that will ensure better protection for themselves should also be respected and protected. It is important that monitoring should happen on what is should be done on how they are impacted by COVID, and also the disaggregation of data to reflect the situation and make their situation more visible is crucial in this time of COVID. My colleagues in the UN again have stressed the importance of ensuring that the right to life is non-derogable, and the right to life is not in any way violated because of emergency responses made by the governments. I would urge indigenous peoples to continue to report on the situation that they face, and on the dominant society and the states to provide adequately the needs that they have to be able to survive this crisis. And I also would urge indigenous peoples to share more widely the efforts that they are doing to protect biological diversity, and of course their own ecological integrity of their territories, because these are the measures that will ensure that such kinds of crises will not break out again. Indigenous people still maintain their capacities, maintain their efforts to protect biodiversity, and not to allow for rampant wildlife trading or destruction of the habitats of wildlife, because these are going to further worsen the situation as we are now seeing in with this pandemic. So support should be provided to indigenous peoples to continue protecting biodiversity, which is a big contribution to enhancing the capacities of all of us to be able to survive such kinds of crises, as well as to prevent this kind of crisis from repeating all over. So I'd like to end by saying that indigenous peoples are highly vulnerable. They are the impacts on them are disproportionate because of discrimination and unequal treatment. But they are also trying their best to do what they can to be able to survive, as well as to maintain the integrity of the environment and the ecology in their territories, which in the long run will be the solution to stopping the spread of viruses that come from animals and that go directly to that are directly infecting indigenous peoples. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best in your efforts to address this issue. That the state should really learn from how what indigenous peoples are doing, and indigenous people should actively engage in reporting as well as in documenting how they are faring in this time of COVID.